All right, well, it is 11 o'clock by my watch. So let's go ahead and get started with this July barbecue, virtual barbecue. I'm Randy Knight. I'm here with Scott Klein, and we are literally in my backyard on the deck, smoking some meat, having some cold drinks, and talking SQL Server. So,
and getting pampered.
By the real force behind SSG, my beautiful wife Sarah, who's bringing us snacks, which is fantastic. I'm modeling the SSG raffle prize for this barbecue. For those of you who don't remember, you get this apron. It says certified grill and SQL master. It's got a I'm not a very good Vanna White, but I'm trying here. It's got a built-in bottle opener. It's got a little cooler koozie thing here, and then those of you who submitted questions, I think, got a koozie in the mail. So, and of course, if you've been watching SSG long enough and seen us at events, you might have gotten a shirt like this. This is our I'm a Groupie SSG t-shirt. So there you have it. Jason, you want to go ahead and advance the slides? So for those of you who don't know me, Microsoft Certified Master. This has said 20 plus years for a very, very long time, and we're going to leave it at that. A decade or more,
We're
I
not
think.
aging ourselves.
So done a lot of things, started SSG in 2010, and excited to be here. Scott?
All right. I don't know. Do I have a slide, Jason? There we are. Yes. All right. So I'm a senior consultant at SQL Solutions Group. I don't know. I quit counting. I don't know how long I've been doing SQL Server. Probably as long as Randy. I got started with SQL 6. That's probably as long as Randy. Prior to coming here, I was worked for Microsoft doing cloud and SQL Server in their data platform, and so this has been awesome. I love being here at SQL Solutions Group.
And then we just have our, those who've been to some of our other webinars have seen this slide multiple times. You know, anytime someone does a free webinar, there's got to be some kind of little sales pitch, right? So
Marketing.
SSG, again, been doing this for about 11 years. We do everything from project-based consulting, remote DBA managed service, health checks. We have a coaching program for, you know, mentoring your folks. So we are, of course, a Microsoft partner and solely focused on the Microsoft data platform. We don't do, you know, other Microsoft stuff. You know, for those who saw the keynote this morning at Inspire, well, you won't be calling us up to set up your Windows 365 cloud PCs.
Right.
That's there's plenty of partners out there that do that, but we do the Microsoft data platform. And the same being true with some of the other databases out there. You know, we focus on Microsoft. So there's a lot of great consulting companies out there that do Oracle and MySQL and other things. That's not us. So
Right.
all right. With that, we've got some, of course, some meat on the smoker. Doing some, I don't know if you can see the smoke. That's asking a lot of an outdoor camera. But we've got some carnitas rolling.
Yeah, I can tell you it smells good. You
know, obviously you can't go through beginning to end smoking meat in an hour webinar.
Right.
So we just kind of have a piece of this. And I know our social media person is posting some pictures out there on social media from the different things. We got a question there looking to have some carnitas shipped. I don't know if we can ship it, but everybody in the SQL family knows this. If you're ever in town, hit us up. We'll have you over for a barbecue.
That's right.
We've done several over the years. When I lived in Utah, we did actually a SQL campfire up in the canyon. So awesome. It was a good time. Right. That was like after a speaker dinner, I think, for SQL Saturday. Anyway, with no further ado, we're going to jump right into the questions. We set this up to be, you know, really informal. if this was a real barbecue, you'd all be here and we'd be sitting around talking shop, right? Most likely. So that's kind of what we're going to do. We have a list of questions that people sent in, and we are going to get started. So Scott's going to take the first one.
All right.
So I'll turn it over to him to read the question, and we'll chat about it.
Yep. And if you have questions that you want to do live, post here, Jason will track those and we can answer those as we go along. All right. So the first question, this was actually asked by one of our customers, Ralph, and he asked, SQL is everywhere, and what's the best place to online to kind of learn about SQL, right? From basic setup to sizing to number of drives and block size and all that kind of stuff. And these are the kind of things that we run into all the time with our customers. And I'll say, Randy and I reviewed these questions. I'll say that, we have our checklist when we go through and do our health checks, but there is a ton of information out online about this stuff, right? We have our checklist. There's Brent Ozar, who's a good friend of ours. He has his information. I think it's brentozar.com. Yep. Right. There's also what we need to understand is what we want to point out, and Randy and I were actually talking about this yesterday. What we want to point out is the question is really how do you install SQL? But there's a lot of pre and post tasks that really how do I say this? Really will ensure the success of your SQL Server installation.
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that installing SQL Server, meaning running the installer,
yep,
is a small portion of what you need to do.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
And
that's pretty easy.
Ralph, this was a great question. One of the things we've talked about over the years is that we should have more content on our site about things like this.
Right.
And something that we're working on that hopefully you'll see in the next few months is one of the things I don't like to do is to reinvent the wheel and just post things on our site that there's good resources out there already.
Yeah.
But one of the problems is there's so much out there. Who do you trust? Right. When you go and Google this. So we've come up with this concept of curated content.
Yeah.
Right. That we'll have a section on our website in different areas of SQL Server. Some of it will point to stuff we've written, but some of it will point to other stuff that's out there.
Correct.
Whether it's Microsoft documents or things that have been written by other members of the community, SQL Server MVPs, whatever. So I think that's good. And the other thing that I wanted to say just in general, these questions, we may not get through all of them today, but this is a great source of ideas for us for future webinars.
Correct. Yep.
Right. So this question in particular, we did a webinar a few months ago on migrating SQL Server using the DBA Tools PowerShell module. We use DBA Tools quite a bit for our installs as well. And so maybe that would be a webinar we should do. Is doing a best practices SQL Server setup using that PowerShell module.
Yeah, Randy mentioned DBA Tools. There's also DBA Checks. He also mentioned, and I was going to point this out, Microsoft. So out on Microsoft's their learning center, there's great information on on all their content. So I would go there, but realistically, I think there's plenty of good content out there. I would, our website, DBA Tools, Brent Ozar's website, all have a lot of information out there on what are the best practices for not just installing SQL Server, but how do you what's pre and post, right? How do you get ready, and then what configuration you have to do after you install SQL Server, right? So good question, Ron.
All right. So the next question we have up here that we're going to talk about, this was a great question. This is something that we've all run into, many times. And the question was, what are the ways you can detect changes in the source data if the source data is replicated from Oracle to SQL Server, and you only have access to SQL Server as the source for your data warehouse? So that one, I think everybody that's worked in a BI team has run into at some point. They don't want to let you have access to the source system. I'm assuming this question is referring to transactional replication. And that being the case, there's a few things that you could do here. And, going from kind of less complex to more complex. One of the things that I have done in the past, and I can't even say that I would recommend this because it's a high maintenance way to do things. But in transactional replication, all of the insert updates and deletes that are run by the distributor on the subscriber, those happen via stored procedures, right? So if you don't have a way in your actual data, a timestamp or something to identify when it changed, you could actually modify those stored procs on that publication to, write to a log table or something that, hey, this key changed at this time, or was inserted, or was updated, or was deleted. You could also potentially do the same thing with triggers on your replicated table. The big issue with both of those is you've now created some complexity for yourself if you ever need to re-push the, re-snapshot the publication, right? So you're gonna have scripts that you remember that after I re-push everything, I need to run this script to modify the procs or to add the triggers or whatnot. There's also change tracking, and Scott and I were talking about that. I don't know that I've ever tried change tracking on a replicated table, so I'd have to see how that would work. That's potentially the simplest to maintain out of these solutions, but a great question.
Yeah,
great question. And obviously, this is informal. Anybody has any other suggestions they want to put out there in the chat?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Go for it.
As much as we like to say that we know everything, we don't know everything.
Nope.
So, all right. This next question came in, and we thought that when they sent this question, they were kind of kidding around, but it's an actual question. They asked, and we know the person that asked this. We won't throw out names, but they asked, are foreign keys evil? No. And Randy and I were joking, but we're going to say developers who refuse to use them are. Right? So there's two things we want to mention here, and Randy actually brought up one of the points. Typically, we think as foreign keys as just RI, referential integrity, right? That's kind of what's our standard. That's what we use foreign keys for, and that's true. But the other thing that we typically don't think about is the performance benefits, right? When we do our health checks, we look at, and one of the things we check for is trusted constraints, right? And there are significant benefits and performance benefits when using trusted constraints. And Randy, if you're able to jump in here, but we don't think in terms of that. And I think we need to start getting people, and here's another blog that we probably ought to, or video that we need to work on, is how do we get people to think beyond just RI and think about, hey, if we don't use foreign keys, or, what are the impact of foreign keys in terms of performance benefits?
Right. And we actually have an old article
right,
about trusted foreign keys or trusted constraints. And that's an important aspect of this.
Yeah.
If you look at your metadata in SQL Server on your, foreign keys, check constraints, there's a column that says is trusted. And you might see that and say, hey, what the heck does that mean?
Right.
And what that is if the constraint was enabled at the entire time that data was loaded into the table, SQL Server can rely on what the values are meeting the criteria of that constraint, right? And so what it will do is, say you have, for example, a column, we'll use a check constraint as an example, a state column in the US.
Yep.
Right. And that there's, 50-ish values. And I say that just because some people use Puerto Rico, Guam, some of those are states.
Right.
But that table could have, 50 million rows in it. And SQL Server knows the cardinality of that is going to be within those 50.
Yep.
We have statistics for the distribution. So you're giving the optimizer another piece of information for it to use as it comes up with a good execution plan.
Yep.
So
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think we need to think beyond just RI and think about how do we think in terms of foreign keys, in terms of just performance benefits around that.
all right. Okay, this was a fun question, this next one. As we said, we've both been doing this for a very long time. The question is, what do you consider your most challenging problem that you have faced and had to overcome in SQL in either development or administration? You know, and this is just
Developers who don't use foreign keys.
and there you go. I wish that was the worst, you know. One of those things that just opens up to all the war stories over the years. And so I thought of one, and I don't even know if I can say it's the most challenging, but it is definitely at the top of my mind because of, let's say, the impact it had on my life.
I gotta say, when I heard this story, I'm glad I'm happy to be part of SSG, but I'm glad I wasn't part of SSG at this time. I'll just say that.
This was about 3 or 4 years ago. I can't remember if it was 2018, 2019.
2019, I think you said.
It was Thanksgiving weekend, and we had a customer that called in somewhat of a panic. They had corrupt databases, severe corruption. This was on like Wednesday before Thanksgiving.
Day before Thanksgiving.
Day before Thanksgiving. And at the end of this story, I'll give you the punchline there, which is even better. But no backups, or they were unable to restore backups. And so this became hardcore, you know, DBC, figure out what could be repaired, what could not be repaired. There was a lot of data that was flat out, you know, corrupt. It was, you know, script the schema, create a new database, BCP out all of the data. And this was, you know, several hundred gigabytes of data, reload. That got all about 10 tables. About 10 tables were corrupted enough that you couldn't even select from, you know, to get to extract the data. And sometimes it's better to be lucky than to be good. And that definitely came true for this customer. All of those tables happened to be part of transactional replication to Europe from their US site. So we were able to go get a backup of the database from Europe, bring it to the US, BCP out the data from those tables that had the data, reapply it, get everything back up and running. This ended up being about 60 plus hours of work between, you know, Wednesday afternoon and Sunday of Thanksgiving weekend. And the punchline is that we had, my wife and I have a lot of kids. We're a blended family. We have 8 kids between the two of us. And the adult ones, of course, are spread around the country. So we have managed to get everybody to come in for the weekend. So we had a full house and wanting to spend time with the family. And the biggest thing, and in fact, I didn't even tell the customer this at the time because I didn't want him to feel bad. I had planned, because everybody was going to be in town together on that Wednesday, prior to the Thanksgiving, we were doing family pictures, and we had it all planned that I proposed to Sarah at those family pictures. So I proposed and did family pictures on like no sleep, you know, for about 48 hours, and, you know, bags under my eyes, and it was a memorable weekend. So, you know, looked at a blog article the other day, is you don't need to have a backup plan. You need to have a restore plan, right? Disaster recovery is important. So that definitely is up there with one of the more challenging things that we had to do.
So if there's a takeaway from this, it doesn't matter how many backups, test your backups in a restore them and make sure they work. Oh my goodness.
I am going to eat a deviled egg while you're talking.
Yeah, I'm sitting there going, yeah. But that was an interesting article too, because we always talk about, you know, make sure you have backups, but we never. It's like the foreign key thing. We need to make sure that we have our restore plan so that we don't run into issues like that. So that's an interesting one. All right, next question. So we did get, when we asked for questions and people were smart, this was awesome. You guys are so smart. We mentioned this was a barbecue. So people actually submitted barbecue questions.
That's right. We got, and so for each kind of section of the technical questions, we decided we'd throw in one of the barbecue
smattering
questions.
of barbecue questions.
So Scott, why don't you go ahead and read the question and we can talk about it.
Yep. And then this is where you guys can jump in and go, hey, we've tried this and this. All right. So the question is, how do you get your brisket the most tender it can be? What marinade do you use? How often do you reapply it, or should you reapply it? Right. That's a good question. I have this book. So there's probably so many ways. I like it pretty tender. One of the recommendations, I have a Traeger. And so when I started doing this, I followed the Traeger recipe, and they recommend that you start off to get it the most tender, put it in the smoker, not wrapped. And then once it hits, I think 60 degrees, take it, wrap it tin foil, and then put it back on to like 200 degrees or something like that. And that is a super juicy and tender brisket. But there are other ways to do that.
So I'm somewhat of a barbecue purist. So for a lot of these questions, one of the things that you'll see is that I really like to follow the keep it simple, KISS principle. And to me, barbecue is good meat, a reasonable rub,
Yep.
smoke, low and slow, right? And
Low and slow, I think
a lot of this, depends on what you're doing. So, the questions were, what marinade do you use? People talk about wrapping it at this point, doing this. Yeah. I've read things about, they call it boating the brisket, where you put it in a pan with some apple juice. I don't do any of that. I have a rub that, I make myself.
Yep.
I rub it well, wrap it up overnight,
Yep.
and just put it on the smoker and let it roll. I don't use marinades. I don't do any of those things. Now, some of this is trial and error, and it depends on what kind of smoker you have, and to a degree, the climate that you're in.
Yeah.
Right. Here in the Pacific Northwest, it's relatively humid.
Yep.
We get so much rain, so moisture isn't as big of an issue. When I lived in Las Vegas, I would put a water pan in the smoker, right, where you just put a pan of water in there, and it generates enough moisture. I also, you can kind of see in the corner here, I'm using a Kamado style smoker, which is ceramic insulated. So it's very easy to maintain temperature. The moisture stays in there. There's not as much exchange with the outside as you might have in some different types of smokers. So I do, Aaron's asking, or no, Andy is asking, sorry, the monitor's a little far away from my old eyes. What's in that rub? I will post the recipe. How's that? It's no secret. It's just a variety of spices. It's got some
Here for you. We're here for you, Andy.
Paprika, salt and pepper. It's pretty simple. Again, I try not to get crazy. Get a good cut of meat.
Yeah.
And the meat itself and the smoke is where the flavor should really come from.
Yeah, there was on the challenging. Jason, scroll up on bit. Someone posted their challenge, some about replication, and they had to. The ultimate solution was to write a dependency checking sprock on the publisher side.
Yep.
Ouch! Dang.
Yeah.
Kudos to you. Holy cow.
Yeah.
Rough.
Yeah.
Anyway.
All right.
Share the barbecue sauce recipe too. From Allison.
Oh, from Allison. For those who don't know, Allison Gonzalez is my daughter, my oldest daughter. Yeah. She also is the one that does our social media. So if you see some of the funny memes and things like that, are sourced from Allison. And share the meat you're cooking. Okay, we're about to move on to the next section of the questions, but before we do that, why not? Let's take a look.
All right.
This is carnitas, and I don't know. Let me grab. By the way, your apron, if you're so fortunate to get it, comes with a handy oven mitt and a little, rag.
Nice.
So I'm just gonna grab one of these pans and see if I can get it so that you can see it. Let's see, kind of. So you can see the juice. It's just pork shoulder cubed with some spices, and we just let that soak and cook down for several hours, shred it up, toss it with some green salsa verde, and tacos, enchiladas,
My mouth is watering
know,
already.
fistfuls with your hands, whatever. It's
You guys
it's
jealous
great
yet?
stuff. So no smell-o-vision. Yep, that's
Yeah.
I had to shower if there was, so that might be a good thing.
Yeah. All right, let's keep going with the questions while we
Let's see.
partake of this yummy.
All right, the next question is another data warehouse / BI type of question. And the first thing I want to say is that BI is not really our core competency. We do some reporting services, SSIS, but more from an integration standpoint, general reporting.
Yep.
If someone wanted us to do an entire data warehouse project, that would be something that we would definitely bring in some outside experts that we know. So that said, the question is this, and this is total opinion, which I love. What is the future of traditional Kimball modeling and its practitioners in the paradigm of big data, Azure Synapse, Cosmos, and Lakehouse? So, and we can kind of boil that down into, it's kind of like, I think I wrote a blog article a few years ago, the DBA is dead, long live the DBA. the Microsoft data platform and data in general, the landscape has changed a lot in the last, 5 to 10 years. And we see a lot of questions like this or things like this about NoSQL technologies or other types of things. And I remember running into this as much as 12 years ago, that some developers at the place that I was working at the time got a hold of an XML database that they really liked, which did I'm trying to remember what it was called, Mark Logic, maybe, if that sounds right for XML. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But for unstructured data, and it did a great job at that.
Yeah.
But then we started seeing OLTP type of systems being built in this NoSQL, unstructured, non-transactional type of environment. So I think choosing the right tool for the job will always be the case. I'm of the opinion that there's always going to be a place for the traditional star schema relational data warehouse. But what we're seeing is lots of technologies that are bringing unstructured data into that. Right. So, and that allows us to solve a lot of problems that we weren't able to solve before. Right. Because, trying to parse that unstructured data and bring it into fact tables, dimensions was just too much of a challenge. The flip side of this, business intelligence has always been interesting to me, because depending upon who you talk to, the right or wrong way to do things is really different. We have, one of the phrases that we hear a lot is, we need a single source of truth, right? So for mention X or report Y, we have situations where, in a large enterprise, depending upon who wrote that report and came up with that metric, it's different, right? It could be as simple as 24 hours versus a calendar day. Right. Or just different ways that people wrote those queries. And so that's always from the BI architect development standpoint been really the focus, is let's build a data warehouse. Those projects tend to be very big bang space shuttle projects. And you also run into people in the business that will say things like, well, I don't trust what's been done to the data to get it to that state. I want to see the original source data. And so we're starting to see a lot of that, right? I mean, if you look at Power BI, for example, it's all about, bringing data in from all kinds of disparate primary sources and massaging it and doing what you want with it. The downside of that is that you end up with even more of this, depending upon who built the, you know,
Yeah.
Power BI workbook and or that data source, you'll get different versions of it. So it's you know, I think, and Scott, I'm dominating this conversation, but
No,
I think it's a fascinating time to be in the data profession. There's so much going on.
Agree 100%, and I think you're spot on. I remember the comment you made. I remember when I was at Microsoft, and Microsoft had just come out with Azure table storage, right? And it, you know, from a cost perspective, you know, it's you know, when you put stuff in the cloud, it's, you know, especially in Azure storage, it's pennies on the dollar, and people thought, oh, hey, you know, I can take, you know, it was table storage. People thought, hey, I can take my relational database, put this in Azure table storage and save money. And then people started doing that and quickly realized that it's not apples and apples, right? Because you don't get, there was no things. And so they quickly, oops, and went back. So your comment was, you know, these are these things that, you know, from a data platform, these NoSQL things, these are complementary, right? They help, like you use the right tool for the right job, Sarah, like you mentioned, right? And this is the way it needs to be. We need to understand the technologies and how to use them, and that's what we help our customers do. Right? So, all right.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Next question. And this was kind of an interesting one. Randy and I talked about this for a little bit. What maximum high availability architecture and DR plan would you propose for SQL Server estate with intensive 24/7 OLTP and Olap transactions? So we started this question a while and decided that we really don't have enough information here because we don't know enough about the environment. But as we talked about it, I think the answer that we're going to provide really boils down to, and hopefully this message comes across, it really depends on what you determine as intensive. What's your definition of intensive? And from a DR plan, this is where we really need to take a step back and understand, and hopefully we all understand, what is RPO and RTO. Good grief, I just forgot what those
recovery point objective.
Recovery point objective, recovery time objective. Yep. Yes, thank you. Recovery point objective, recovery time objective. You know, how long does it take to recover from a natural disaster, and how much data really are we willing to lose during that time? You know, from that time, and that's what's really going to drive your kind of intensive answer, right? And the second part of that, which I really liked Randy's answer when we talked about this, is we have to think about the cost dimension, right? Because, you know, you talk to any business, and I loved his example. You talk to any business, oh, how much time can we afford to be down, or how much data can we afford to lose? And typically, you know, they say zero, right? We can't afford to lose any data. We can't afford to be down at all. Well, okay, but when you talk about that, then your cost goes way up, right? Way up. So we need to understand, you know, the business needs to be involved in these discussions, but understand that, you know, the less downtime that you really want to implement, the more that your cost goes up, right? So, you know, typically we recommend, you know, from a backup restore perspective, right? How much data are you willing to lose from an RPO RTO perspective? And that's what your kind of a high availability architecture and DR plan is based around, really.
Yeah. So I think those are great points. One of the things that discussions I often get into with customers is, you know, there's, I think, some misunderstanding out there even about these terms.
Yeah.
High availability and disaster recovery.
Yeah.
They're two completely different things.
Yeah.
Right. Disaster recovery is, we went down.
Yep.
We had an outage.
Yep.
How do we get back?
How do we get back?
How do we get back from that? And how long will it take? And how much data will we lose?
The recovery point.
That's your RPO, RTO, all of that. High availability is to prevent you from going down at all, right?
Yep.
And that's everything from, you know, old school, just, you know, fault tolerant hardware in your physical server, you know, dual power supplies, RAID arrays, you know, things like that. all the way up to, availability groups or other clustering technologies with nodes at multiple data centers so that you can, fail over from one data center to another.
Yeah.
And the question was interesting to me because it described it as a SQL Server estate with intensive 24/7 OLTP and Olap transactions.
Right.
And that's important. But again, I think regardless of whether you're talking about a 100 gig database or multi-terabytes and 10 users or thousands of users, that RPO RTO discussion is
Needs to happen.
it needs to happen, and that's what is going to drive the answer,
Correct.
to that question.
And we did a couple webinars on that, right?
Yeah.
So I would highly recommend, and I'm also going to bring up, Randy, another answer to that. I would highly recommend, though, that you go to our, sorry for giving you a sales pitch, but go to our YouTube page and look for those disaster recovery, because we define what the difference between high availability and disaster recovery. How do we understand RPO and RTO? Great webinar there. But I also think the answer to this question is we also did another webinar on hybrid high availability and how to use that in DR scenarios. And I would, that is a much more cost-effective solution, in my opinion, to answer your question, right? Because, we think about, well, how do we quantify, the cost and, and things like that. I would go watch those videos and then kind of come back to us and say, hey, yep, on YouTube channel, there you go. Jason Russell pointed it out there. Go watch those videos. And then
by the way, Scott, it's not a sales pitch if we're sending you to free content.
That's true.
Right.
It's a freebie pitch.
Now we'd be happy to have you hire us to help you do this.
That's true.
That's a sales pitch.
That's a sales pitch. Good point. Yeah, but I would just, go watch the information. So those videos where we talk about these things, and hopefully that'll help answer your question. But I would look at some of the hybrid things, because that'll give you some of the things I think you're looking at.
All right. Next question in this area. And this one was a little bit out of left field to me because it's not something that I've really spent time with. Yep. But the questions, I've always formatted my drives with NTFS. However, there is now the refs file system. Should I be using that over NTFS? I know when refs came out, Paul Randall made an issue about how DBCC CheckDB created sparse files and refs didn't handle those well. My answer to that is super short. We continue to use and recommend NTFS. Yeah. It's kind of like back in the day, you had the option to store your SQL files on raw partitions that don't have a file system. Right. But NTFS configured correctly. That's one of those kind of pre-install best practices we were talking about. At least 64K NTFS allocation units. Sometimes bigger will even be better depending upon your hardware, but 64K is kind of the best practice baseline. The default for NTFS is 4K, right? So you're talking about significantly more IO or IOPS.
And this goes back to the original actually the first question that that we started with is kind of the pre-install, right? Making sure your drives, what are the things you need to do before you even install SQL Server? This is one, right? Formatting to 64K before you even install SQL Server.
Yep.
So. All right, next question. When do I need to grant the right lock pages in memory? And this is another one, the pre-install stuff. We recommend almost always. I can't even remember a point where we don't do that. And the reason being is because I'm going to kind of rely on Randy here because I'm not a SQL OS person, but I think it's the way SQL Server and the SQL OS manages those pages in memory.
Right. So the whole idea here is that, Windows, with the Windows applications that use the Windows APIs for memory management, you have a page file, right? And Windows is going to swap things between the page file on disk and memory as it needs to. Well, SQL Server has a component called SQL OS. That is how it does memory management, thread management, things like that. So it doesn't work the same way as most things do in Windows. Lock pages in memory is essentially telling Windows, don't take pages, don't steal memory pages from the SQL Server.exe process. And we recommend and we tend to implement lock pages in memory as a default best practice. That's not to say there aren't cases where it wouldn't make sense, but generally speaking, SQL Server should never be paging, is really what it comes down to, right? And so, that's one of the things from a health monitoring standpoint we look at on a dedicated SQL Server is, first off, your page file, right? If you've got, 512 gigabytes of memory, we don't need a 500 gigabyte page file, right? We really don't need a page file at all, right? And we shouldn't be paging on a dedicated SQL Server.
Yeah.
Okay, this next question was kind of last minute. We just added it last night. That came in. Is SQL in the Azure cloud affordable? Wow, now there's a loaded question, right?
Next question.
So I think for this one, you have to define affordable.
Yeah.
Right?
100%.
One of the things that I see quite often is we talk to people, particularly in the SMB, small, medium-sized business market, that are looking at moving to the public cloud for all the benefits that brings them, but they're moving from, I've got a server, maybe a rack of servers in my office in a server room, maybe I've got it cooled and powered correctly, maybe not, right? But it's not enterprise class infrastructure by any stretch. Right. It doesn't have the fault tolerance. It's not the level of gear, and so if you compare that to the cost of Azure SQL DB or anything else, of course, the cloud is going to be more expensive. Right. So, I've made the comment before, and I won't go so far as to say this all the time, but I believe that if an organization isn't investing 7 figures in infrastructure, the public cloud is a great place to be, right? Because if you're not big enough to be spending millions on your infrastructure, then you likely don't have the level of resources and infrastructure that you're sharing in the cloud. That's the whole idea, right? So, I think a lot of early cloud adopters and the early cloud language was around cost savings. Right. That, it's scalable. You only use what you need and whatever. And I think we found, several years down the road that that's not the primary reason people are going to the cloud. It's to me, what the cloud does is for the first time, it makes that enterprise level infrastructure available to the small business with one database and 10 users. Right. Yeah. So great question.
Yeah. Again, I think it's a it depends type of answer, right? Based on what you're trying to.
Right. So there's a question that's came up in the chat. Do you guys do much with Azure SQL or Azure Synapse SQL or just on-prem? I would say we're still mostly on-prem. We're kind of driven by what our customers ask for. We're probably 20%, I'd say, of our business is cloud or really hybrid cloud. Right. This gets presented, I think, by vendors as, oh, you can have, cloud or on-prem or hybrid cloud. And I think what we're seeing is that everything is going to be hybrid cloud eventually. Yes. Right. It's pretty rare to find someone that doesn't have anything in the cloud. Right. Likewise, it's extremely rare to find someone who's not doing anything on-prem.
But if you're asking if we can do Azure SQL, yes.
Yeah, and that's 100%. One of the reasons that I hired Scott. Is Scott, came to us from Microsoft, and some of you may know him. He's been around for a long time, and really has focused on Azure SQL from the very beginning. I think he wrote one of the very first books.
The very first
Azure SQL book. So we certainly we do those projects, and we certainly have that skill set. Yeah. And we're largely driven by what our customers are looking to do.
Yeah, but if you're asking if we can do Azure SQL, Azure Synapse, yes. So, all right, next question. Oh, that one's yours. Actually.
Yep. All right. This next section, we're moving into performance questions. We have about 15 minutes left, so we'll probably pick some of the bigger ones here. tips for troubleshooting IO weights was one of these. That is a fantastic question. One of the things that happens with IO, particularly for DBAs, because that's where we live, is we focus on just SQL Server, right? And, you know, maybe we're seeing a lot of IO weights, a lot of IO stalls on our data files.
Yep.
And so there's two directions we go. We go to our storage admin or our sysadmins and we say, hey, you know, we're having IO latency, what's going on? And they go and they look at the SAN,
yeah,
and they say, you're crazy. There's no latency. This stuff's all, you know, like sub-millisecond, right? You know, I mean, there's no latency. And what we forget is that there's a huge layer of technology stack in between
SQL.
the storage
Yep.
and SQL Server, right?
Yep.
We have our storage, whether it's spinning disk, SSD, NVMe, SAN, local, whatever, right?
Yep.
But from there, you have a storage fabric, right? In other words, how is the storage connected to the server, right? Is it fiber channel? Is it iSCSI? If it's iSCSI, there are all kinds of, you know, hidden kind of snakes in the grass. One of the bigger issues we run into with storage is when someone's using iSCSI, sysadmin set it up and it's like, hey, this is just Ethernet, this is just networking. And there's a whole bunch of things that you need to do,
Yep.
jumbo frames and different things for iSCSI. And then when you get to the physical server, you've got all the layers there, right? If you're virtualized, you've got the hypervisor layer. There are some huge issues that we see out there with best practices in VMware,
Yep.
for example, that the way you set up a VMware environment and a guest VM for a commodity server, like an application server, web server, is really, really different than an IO intensive
Right.
thing like a database, right? So is your hypervisor layer configured optimally?
Yep.
Is your at the OS, right, in terms of your controllers? You know, another area with IO that we've run into over the years is, you know, it used to be, if you've been doing this as long as we have, you know, DBAs were really focused on spindles.
Yes.
Right? Making sure the transaction log was on a different set of spindles than the data files, than the indexes, than the backups. Well, over the years, as storage has gotten, you know, more sophisticated, and that's become abstract and everything, you know, even before we got to you know, non-magnetic storage, you know, it would be everything's coming out of a disk spool of hundreds of spindles, right? And so, you know, storage admins, storage vendors were saying things like, it doesn't matter. That stuff doesn't matter anymore. And again, if we think about that stack that sits in between the storage and SQL Server, it does matter.
It does matter.
It still matters that you have, you know, multiple data files.
Yep.
It still matters that you have, you know, separate volumes for data, transaction log, temp DB, right?
Yep.
Because of how all of that IO works in between.
Yep.
Right. So one of the things we do when we see IO issues is we start with kind of what we call a full stack review of that from the hardware through the hypervisor layer all the way to SQL Server. And then of course we can, you know, we can focus on reducing IO.
Yep.
And all of that said, if you've got all your best practices in place, you know, when we see things that are doing, you know, hundreds of millions or even billions of logical reads, which is real, you know, we see that all the time. There's no amount of hardware you can throw at that to fix that problem.
Right.
Right. So you do have a code problem or a database problem that you need to address, but make sure you don't omit the non-SQL Server piece of that, I guess is the thing that I would say.
Yep. All right. We're getting questions coming in. We may not get to those. So Jason, what we're going to ask is, can you create a slide that has Randy's and I's email address on it so that if we don't get your question, they can email us? We'll put that up at the end.
Yeah,
All right.
the other thing that I'd say on that is that, you know, all of these questions, the ones that are coming in, the ones that we may not get to, are a great source for us for future webinars,
Yep.
you know, future blog articles, because it tells us the things that you folks out there are interested in hearing about.
Correct.
So
Andrea will definitely get to your question, either, if not today, through email. All right. Next question. When should you use column store indexes and how to use them most effectively? I don't know for Andy, I don't know. I am not a column store guru by any stretch. And so I had to email a friend of mine and ask him this question, and his response. And so we're going to give you his response, right? He said, when doing analytics over massive amounts of data, like over 1 million, including HTAP scenarios. When we say HTAP, this is hybrid transactional and analytical processing. So what he said was, if you're doing high analytical data processing, right? Analytical data processing on very large data sets, then you should consider using column store indexes, right? If you're not doing, you know, if essentially what he said is, if you're not doing high, if there's not enough data, column store indexes really aren't worth, you know, putting them on there, because they really benefit when you're doing working against high volumes of data, right? So that's his answer. If you want, we'll try to, whoever asked that question, if you want more, we'll try to get to that. All right.
I'm gonna skip a few questions here, just so that we can make sure that we pick up the in this last few minutes,
Yep.
Some of these ones that I think are more interesting.
Yeah.
Which is not to say anything. If your question didn't get covered, I'm not saying that you're boring, but I just wanted, you know, there's only so much time in an hour here.
Yeah.
So this one, I love. This is one of my kind of pet areas, I guess, things that I like to really focus on.
Yep.
And the question is this: given the penchant for developers to use simple CRUD operations, how would you suggest getting the application away from doing the processing and turning those CRUD operations into more set-based processes? This is the ultimate DBA versus developer conflict that has existed, you know, from the beginning of time, it feels like.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Over the last, you know, decade or so, it's, in my opinion, gotten a lot worse because of the advent of ORMs.
Yeah.
Object relational mappers, right? Things like Entity Framework and Hibernate, things of that nature. So what happens, and from getting a little bit computer science geeky here, there's this problem in computer science called object relational impedance, or impedance. That sounds a lot like another word if you say impedance. But, and the issue is that the way relational databases organize things and the way object-oriented organize things are really, really different, right? And ORMs are how we've come up with a way to map these to each other. A lot of old school DBAs are just anti-ORM.
Yeah.
You know, we should be doing everything in stored procedures. ORMs are crap. I can't see the queries. I can't do this. And while I understand that mindset, I'm here to say the ship has sailed, right? Entity Framework is not going away.
Yeah.
And so we're a lot better off as DBAs, I think, in learning how Entity Framework works. And so, yes, I'm saying learn Entity Framework, learn your ORM, because one of the things that you will find is that there are good and bad ways to write code against Entity Framework, to write your link queries. So you can absolutely use Entity Framework and write those link queries and use your data in a set-based manner, right? Mm-hmm. And so if we go to our developers and say, hey, you know, this thing's a loop, it's taken forever, it's not set-based, let's work together on your Entity Framework code and make this work better.
Yep.
That's going to be a lot easier sell than quit using this. You need a stored proc.
Yeah.
Right. Not that there's not benefits to stored procedures. We know that there are.
Right.
The other thing that I would definitely say, there's a configuration setting in Entity Framework that allows you to turn on query tracing. so that on the application server, it will log all the actual SQL queries, which is a fantastic way. And if you've been tuning entity framework systems for any time at all, the queries are very recognizable, right?
Yeah.
They have a format that is pretty ugly to try to see and figure out, but at least you can see what's going on.
Yep.
So, so I guess the overall answer to that question for me would be to help your developers learn how to use their tools that they prefer to use more effectively in a set-based manner.
Yep.
So,
all right. Yeah, I like that answer. Okay.
BBO. Yep.
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 Okay, I'm gonna take.
Let's take one more question, and then you know, we got a couple of smoking questions we still got to get to. So,
yep.
you know.
All right, so I'm gonna the question I'm gonna answer is one. I'm gonna pick this one because it's been asked, and we have several clients asking this same question. How do we track who's filling up TempDB? That is a really great question, and I'm gonna answer it this in two ways, because we've got a few of our clients who are asking that same thing. I'm going to say there's different ways to tackle this, but one of the ways that that we've looked at is using extended events, because there's an extended event called database file size change that you can look at, and it'll tell you anytime TempDB changes, it'll write to the extended event logs, and it'll tell you who did it, when it happened, query, and all that kind of stuff. And it's and at that point, you can have another job or something like that that will read that the logs into a table or alert you or things like that. There's also, if you're using like SentryOne or any of the other tools, they have alerts that will tell you when.
I was going to say SQL Sentry, you know, we're a big SQL Sentry shop.
Yep.
We've been a partner with SQL Sentry, then SentryOne, and now SolarWinds, as they've acquired the product for many years. Big users of SQL Sentry, and they recently added a bunch of TempDB stuff into what they're doing that you can access through the portal. So if you're fortunate enough to be using a tool like that, there's some great ways to look at that.
I brought up extended events or other ways just in case you don't.
Of course. Well, and the other thing that I always tell people about tools, I'm an advocate of tools, right? But if you're in a situation where you can't get the budget or whatever the case may be, realize that every tool that's out there is using the instrumentation that Microsoft has built into SQL Server to get their data, right? Whether it's extended events, whether it's DMVs, whether it's looking at the query store, the plan cache, right? It's all there. So it's not like tools are doing anything you can't do yourself. It's just going to be a lot more work. So,
and I did want to bring up, there are, if you hit the interweb and type in, how do you track up who's filling TempDB? There are scripts all over creation. So you will find all sorts of answers.
And I think this comes back to this concept of curated content. Right? Because one of the things I don't like to do is just tell people, oh, hey, Google that. You'll find lots of stuff out there. Because you will, but not all of it's accurate. Right? So I think, you know, these are great questions and things that we can use, you know, as kind of drivers as we start to build that. So we're just about out of time. It's 11:58 here. There was a fascinating smoking question. It was best rubs for beef and goat meats. And I have to admit, I've never smoked or I think eaten goat.
Me neither.
So, you know, Scott did, you know, do some looking on the internet, and there's a Dave Spence spicy goat rub. Andy says goat is delicious. Well, see, now this is a challenge, right?
So
you know,
so is llama.
Need to. So is llama.
That's hilarious.
Okay, Andy, when you come to town, we'll smoke some exotic meats.
Exactly.
You know, there's actually, that makes me think, there's in one of the towns here near Seattle, there's a restaurant that's almost like everything they have is just exotic, just unusual. You know, like, I mean, they had, you know, python something or other on the menu, you know. So
I'm trying to find a meat store that has elk. That's
pretty interesting. So so yeah, and then was there any other smoking questions?
Yeah, there was another. I think we missed one more. Oh yeah.
Oh, ribs. Okay. When smoking ribs, do you wrap with paper foil or not wrap at some point during the process? So from my perspective on this, and again, I like to keep it simple. I don't do anything like that. I throw them on the smoker. I keep them moist, right? Maybe I'll put a water pan in there. Maybe I'll spritz them. I typically will use like a mix of apple juice and apple cider vinegar. Apple juice is like the barbecue pitmaster's secret weapon. Use apple juice for everything because it adds moisture. It's not water, so it doesn't make it soggy, and you can't taste it. I mean, it just you know, it's a big part of it. But that's what I do. A lot of people like what they call the 3-2-1 method, which is 3 hours, and of course hours are never what you really go by with barbecue because it's just kind of done when it's done. Yeah. But 3 hours of just bare ribs, with the rub on the smoker, and then 2 hours wrapped either in foil or paper, whatever, and then at the end you take that off. If you're gonna glaze it with barbecue sauce or whatever, for the last hour or so. Yeah. So that's my method. I don't know, Scott, if you have.
No, I'm sort of the same. I like the low and slow, right? And I'm experimenting with different ways. There's a book out on Amazon I got that just goes through, a smoking. I got to remember the name. And there's so many ways to do it. I would just recommend experiment, right? Wrap it, don't wrap it halfway, apple juice spritzer, I don't think you can go wrong. And it just depends on
I will say, at least for me, and a lot of people say brisket is the hardest, cut to master.
Yep. For
me, it's ribs. Ribs are one of the hardest ones to get exactly right for me.
Yeah.
And it's because there's not a whole lot of meat compared to like a pork shoulder or a brisket or whatever.
Yeah.
And so the line between overcooked and dry and just right is a very thin line, Right. So
yeah. Hey, Randy, I can comment on the 3-2-1 method a bit.
Okay, go for it.
So as you just mentioned, when I was first smoking ribs, I had a hard time. I wasn't getting the results I wanted. But in the middle step, the 2 hours in the foil, I realized if you turn it meat side down and add in some moisture, like some apple juice, maybe you could do root beer or Dr. Pepper, and maybe some brown sugar. If you put it meat side down, then it's in that moisture, which helps to keep it from going dry.
Okay.
And then, like you said, in the last hour or so, sauce it up, get it nice and finished, and yeah, it's worked really well doing that.
I may give that a shot because I have not had a lot of success with 3-2-1, which is I kind of just went back to just leaving them on there and just keeping them moist. But that's great. All right, it's 12:02, so we're a little bit past our time here. We'll wrap up here with our drawing. I know everybody wants the fancy barbecue apron like I have. You also get the set of grilling tools. There's a brush and a fork and a spatula and some tongs. And of course, it wouldn't be, the company sponsored thing if it didn't have something on there. If you can't read that, it says it's rare to find SQL experts as good as SQL Solutions Group. So there you go. Jason's going to take care of the drawing here on the chat, and we will be sending out the apron set and the tools. Thank you for coming. Hopefully this was something that was just a little bit different. Summertime barbecue, just kind of sit and talk shop. And we'll be back in September with our regular webinar schedule. And Jason, I don't know if you have a slide yet on the September webinar, but what we are going to be talking about is Azure Arc. Azure Arc was just released, general release, I believe at Build last month, 2 months ago.
Yeah, like last couple months, I think.
But Azure Arc, just briefly, if you haven't heard of it, allows you to extend your on-premise environment into the cloud so that you're using the same set of tools or the same kind of, single pane of glass to manage your on-premise servers, SQL servers, and so forth as you are in Azure. And so things like log analytics, Azure Monitor, all of those tools that you have for Azure VMs are now available for your on-premise servers. You also can run a Kubernetes cluster on-premise and run some of the Azure Platform as a Service data services, right? So what was this?
I'm the guy, Joe, yeah.
Okay. So anyway, that's going to be on September 15th. Should be fun. We're actually building some things with Azure Arc that we were using internally for our stuff. So we'll be showing you some of that, and it's new technology, right? So we'll be learning right along with everybody else. So
yeah, the link to register is in the chat. You can do that already today. And for this drawing, Randy, did we decide you had to be present, or?
I think you should be present. I don't know how many we have still who stuck with us the whole time.
And if we didn't get your questions too, feel free to email us. Now we'll either answer them or do a webinar, blog post, something like that.
Yep, absolutely.
So please feel free to answer. Send us an email.
Absolutely.
Andre's here.
And in case you were wondering, the answer to every question that we didn't answer is it depends, right? Because that's what we say for everything.
I apologize to Steve Jones for not answering his question, but it depends, Steve.
That's right.
It really depends.
That's right.
Well, so, I am using a random selector, and the first person who was selected that is still on the webinar is Michelle Olson. So you are our winner, Michelle.
All right.
Woo! All right, Michelle.
Michelle gets the apron. We do have we have one request that when you get it, you need to send us a picture wearing it so that we can, post it on our post it on our site,
Yeah, so, we want to see next to a smoker or next to a barbecue.
Right. Or somewhere, So thanks, everyone.
We'll be in touch for your address, Michelle.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
I just have one question.
Thanks for being here.
Sorry.